The flood of Jews who came in to the United States after 1882 posed certain problems for Jews who were already in this country. And we're going to talk about those problems today. They provided us with a number of tasks. Now, for those who were already in the United States, Jews who were already here and who had been here for perhaps 50 or even 100 years, they had two jobs. One was to maintain some aspect of Jewish identity, whether they were going to be Orthodox or Reform or something else or secular. They had to figure out what it meant to be Jewish in this new world. The second thing that they had to do was to show other Americans what it meant to be an acceptable Jew in the United States, and also that the new people were not the same, that the ones who had been here for a while were different from the ones who were coming in after 1882. Now, for the new arrivals, there were actually three different jobs. The first was, American Jews had already developed a synthesis of what it meant to be a Jew in the United States. The new arrivals had to figure out, how do we fit into this matrix of what it means to be a Jew here? How do we become Jewish in America in the way that will fit in with the people who are already here and who call themselves Jews? The second thing was that they had to somehow fit into the American Jewish community. They had different needs and different problems and different styles. And what was that going to mean for institutions and groups in America? Jewish groups and non-Jewish groups. We'll talk about the non-Jews next week in the next lecture. But they also had to adjust to America. And the America that they met in the 1880s and 90s and 1900s was different than the America that the earlier German immigration movement met before the Civil War. An awful lot had happened in 50 years, and so these new Jews had to adjust to an America that was very different from what their earlier co-religionists had met when they came to America. Now, let's stop a minute and talk about assimilation and acculturation. There are really two different ways to adjust to a new situation. One is called assimilation. To assimilate means to become like the host society. And if you look at this diagram, which we'll put actually into the video, there's a red circle. And the red circle is essentially entirely within the host society. That means that there is very little difference, if any, between the small group, the minority, and the majority society. They've become identical. The guest society, as I call it on this chart, has essentially lost its difference with the major society, the host society, and they are indistinguishable. Now, this kind of assimilation is not always successful. And as the number of immigrants came along, and there were nativist and xenophobic reactions among non-Jews, sometimes the urge to assimilate was resisted by the host society. There's a wonderful story about a man named Fleischman in Cincinnati who thought, well, I'll become a member of the Methodist Church. I'll become a member of the Hyde Park Methodist Church, which is the height of non-Jewish society. So he went to the church and he applied to take classes in becoming a Christian and a Methodist. He took those classes and he presented himself for conversion and membership in the church. And they said, we'll convert you, but you can't be a member of the church because we don't take Jews. assimilation didn't work. He was never going to be able to shake it. Now, acculturation is different. Acculturation means that you keep some part of your identity at the same time that you become part of the majority civilization, the host. And there are, on our chart, 3 different models. One, the blue circle, is minimally acculturated. That is to say, they take as little from the majority civilization as they possibly can. In general civilization, you might think of the Amish, who live among people in Pennsylvania and Ohio, but have kept themselves quite separate in many, many ways. Or if you think about Jews, you might think about Hasidic Jews, who certainly use the same air, water, police, fire department, transportation system, and so on, but they still maintain a very large degree of separation. And then there is the maximally acculturated person. That's this circle down here, where the people are largely like the host society, but they have some degree of difference. And that may be a private part of their lives, such as their religious behavior, or it may be their food habits, or something else. But they keep substantially as part of the society around them. And most of us have figured out that we really belong in this moderately acculturated part, where there is part of us who is different, and part of us who would be the same. And that varies, and people make all kinds of choices about how much do they want to acculturate. Well, the Jews who came to America in the 1880s, 90s, and so on, had to make these choices as well. And they did. And some of them stayed as much Orthodox and as much like the old world as they could, and some of them became as American as they possibly can or could. A good example of this is refusing to speak Yiddish. We don't want to be seen as different, and so we won't speak. We will try to get rid of our accent. We will try to raise our children as Americans, and many did. Now, this period of time produced an enormous amount of ambivalence in the Jewish community. The so-called German Jews, those who had been here 50 years or so, saw the newcomers as a threat to their identity. They had worked very hard to become sophisticated Americans. After all, remember, they had come from Western Europe. They had come from Germany and France, from England, from Switzerland, from parts of the European continent that were already very sophisticated. Germany in the 19th century was the home of the highest culture to which a person could aspire in Western world. And the music, the universities, the science. If you wanted to become a doctor, you went to a German university, even if you were an American. All kinds of things. And so they came here with a notion of what it meant to be a sophisticated Western person. They transferred that notion to America. They adjusted it to some degree because of the frontier and what America was all about. But they basically tried very hard to become that kind of sophisticated person. They wore suits, and they drove cars eventually, and they lived in nice houses, and they learned English as fast as they possibly could, and they banked, and they did business, and they were part of clubs, and if they couldn't be part of Christian clubs, they created their own clubs so that they were like the others. Their religion was essentially very much like Protestant religion. The Reformed Judaism of the time could be seen as an imitation of Protestant religion in America. So that's one side of it. But the other side of it was interesting. They still saw the immigrant as a kinsman, as a brother, as a sister. These were people to whom they were related by a common identity and a common destiny. And there was a basic religious duty that they understood, that they would care for these new immigrants as much as they could. This was essentially the nobility of Jewish life, taking care of the less fortunate. And so noblesse oblige was part of their makeup. And they created institutions that would take care of these people. They established a number of pioneering social services. These were very creative and thoughtful people. And many of the social services and institutions that they created became models for others to follow in American society. So, for example, they created the settlement house. And here we have to talk about a woman named Lillian Wald, who was a New Yorker and who had been trained in the upper class society. She was born in Western New York, came to New York City, and immediately understood that the poor people on the Lower East Side of New York needed some kind of an assistance. So the settlement house, what was it about? It was to settle them and to help them become American. And often settlement houses were called by American names. In Milwaukee, for example, the settlement house was called the Abraham Lincoln Settlement House. And you may know of that because there's a cookbook called the Settlement Cookbook that comes out of the Milwaukee Settlement House. It was a way of raising money so that they could take care of the immigrants who came to Milwaukee. What did they do? They provided education. They had classes of every kind straight through the day, starting in early morning, for mothers and children and people who weren't working and people who were off work. And then later on during the day, English as a second language and citizenship classes and etiquette classes, how to eat properly. You don't eat with your hands, you eat with a fork, and this is the way you hold your fork, and this is the way you set the table. They did this. They provided clothing. They had job referrals. They provided coal to heat the houses during the winter, and advice. Eventually, the settlement house succeeded so well that in the 1930s and 40s, it began a morphing process which eventually led it to become the Jewish Community Center. But that's a later story. Now, the most famous settlement house of all was the Henry Street Settlement in the Lower East Side. It was called the Henry Street Settlement because it was on Henry Street. And it was Lillian Wald's home base, and it was a place where all of these services were provided. Out of this process came a number of other activities that the social workers who served on the Lower East Side and the rich people who were on the upper parts of Manhattan combined to make possible, because they knew that they had to do this. So, for example, the first school nurses came out of this. The idea of putting a nurse in the school so that when children came to school and they were sick or became sick, somebody could look after them and prescribe a treatment plan. Now, that was wonderful, except they lived in hovels. What do? You create a program of visiting nurses. Nurses who go into the houses, into the apartments, into the tenement buildings, and they visit people and they make suggestions about how to care for people who are ill, how to make this a more sanitary place, how to deal with somebody who is really sick. This was a wonderful activity and provided not only better health, but better nutrition and sanitation. The Educational Alliance building, which was also on the Lower East Side, provided all kinds of educational activities, and it's still there, and it still houses Jewish activities and publications. One of the interesting innovations was the care of Jewish orphans. Now, you may find this hard to believe, but around 1905, there were 3 large Jewish orphanages in greater New York. There may have been as many as 12 to 15,000 Jewish orphans, kids that couldn't be cared for. These orphans were in desperate straits. But this was a scene out of the worst image of Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist, and Fagin. And these kids were regimented, fed gruel, and taken care of in really quite primitive ways. The Jewish Family Service began a new project in Hawthorne, New York. Hawthorne is a little village in Westchester County. And what they did was they created a cottage system of small houses that would have approximately 8 children, maybe 10, and a young couple who would be house parents and could serve as mentors and surrogate parents for these kids. And that model of cottage system became the dominant model for the finest orphanages and childcare all over the country by today's standards. Nobody houses kids today in great big dormitories of 100 or 200 kids. Nowadays, it's small groups with personal attention, and it all started because the Jewish Society in New York decided we've got to do a better job. One of the institutions that was very influential was the Cooper Union. The Cooper Union was not a Jewish institution, but it was a headquarters for adult education. And during the evening especially, the classes were mobbed. Some of the greatest philosophers like John Dewey and Horace Callan and others taught there. And they provided an intellectual stimulation that relieved the boredom and the stultifying pressure of sweatshop work and gave people a vision of a better life that they could look forward to, if not for themselves, then for their children. Now, another society that came about as a result of this immigration was something called the Landsmannschaft. Landsmann, somebody from the same land, somebody from the same area of Europe, and Schaft, organization, or society. These were societies that were built up by people who came from the same region of Europe. And they clustered together to support each other's needs. What did they do? They provided mutual help. Every week, they would contribute a little bit, a dime, a quarter, whatever they could manage to tax each other. And when the needs arose, the doctor that they employed often would call on people in their apartments or in their tenements. They would provide burial services. They would provide sick care. They would provide weddings. They would sometimes provide a dowry. They did all kinds of things. And today, just very recently, the Bialystoker Landsmannschaft Home for the Aged was the last one to close, and it was in the last 5 or so years. One of the things they also did was create newspapers and other publications. New York especially was a hotbed of Jewish journalism. in Yiddish, in English, and in Hebrew. And one of the most interesting pieces of journalism was called Bintel Brief. This was an advice column where people would write in their questions. It was the Dear Abby of its day. And people would write in and say, how do I handle this or that? Or I'm having a fight with my husband, or he's not willing to adjust in this way, or my mother-in-law is a pain in the neck. What do I do? And the editor of the forwards would respond and say, well, here's a possibility. Here's what you can do. The most influential paper in New York was the Forwards. Now, there's a joke about a man getting on the bus and he's reading the Yiddish newspaper. And the man sitting next to him says, how come you're reading it backwards? He said, I'm not reading it backwards. I'm reading the Forwards backwards. Because it's in Hebrew, so he read the opposite direction. Yeah. So in the 30s, this paper had a circulation of around 300,000 copies. Today, that's reduced. Immigration has ceased essentially, and so it's down toward 100,000 or 150,000 today. The man who was the lifeblood of this newspaper was a Jewish journalist by the name of Abraham Kahan. Kahan was an immigrant himself, and he was a representative of a style of Jewish politics called Social Democrats. This party had been founded in 1894 in America, and originally it was keyed in with communist thought. Kahan broke with that party in 1897. He had a fight, and he created his own political movement, which was different from the Social Democrats who stayed aligned with the ultra-left wing. One of the ways in which people helped acculturate the immigrant was through conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism, as you have learned, is something that arose right around this time in the early part of the 20th century, and was an attempt to offer the immigrant a cultural and religious style that would be hospitable and comfortable for him or her, and yet still acceptable in America. And basically what we find in the American Jewish community of this time is most services are intended to Americanize newcomers as quickly as possible. They wanted to remove the negative image as much as possible, and the acculturated Jews who had been here before wanted very much to make these folks into Americans in their own image. That produced some tensions between the different parts of the community, because the Eastern European Jewish immigrant wanted to retain a certain style and a certain difference that was not congenial for those who had been here before. There is a minute book of a synagogue in the Midwest where they appropriated a large amount of money, $2,000, to provide for a bath and a shave for all of the immigrant men who came to the city, not realizing that this was offensive to those who wanted to keep their beard and their payos, their sidelocks, as a religious obligation. So there were tensions, and this led to some differences, different organizations and different styles in the community, different synagogues. Very often they had their own synagogue where they would gather as people from the same village or the same community or same region. One of the side benefits of this entire operation was that the profession of social work got a boost, because people began to train themselves and then eventually were trained as professional social workers. And that is a new development. One of the things that came out of the Landsmannschaft, the Mutual Aid Society, was in fact our own Social Security program in America. And when that began under Roosevelt in the mid-30s, the first people who were executives of that program were largely Jewish, because they had had experience running mutual aid societies and self-insurance societies in the Jewish community. Of course, the newcomers felt that the German Jews had abandoned their Jewishness way too much. They thought they were nothing less than Gentiles. And so their response to all of these services was, of course, gratitude. They were happy to have the food and the coal and the clothing and the jobs. But there was also contempt, because they thought that these other people had managed to throw out the water with the baby, or the baby with the water, and they also felt some guilt that they couldn't be like they had been raised in Europe. So this is a complex relationship, one where there is considerable distance between the two parts of the community, and yet also closeness. German Jews wanting them to change and become Americans, Orthodox Jews wanting themselves to remain as they were, Eastern and Western not getting along terribly well for quite a while. And so they advanced themselves through the settlement house and through other techniques, and eventually, as we will find out, immigration began to slow down with World War I and then some American legislation, and the process of Americanization was almost automatic and took place without an awful lot more help. So next time, we're in the 13th lecture, we're going to talk about the reaction of the American community to these new arrivals, and that will be a somewhat different story.